Believing and questioning often seem like two opposing actions. A believer may put questioning aside to avoid undermining their faith. Someone who questions, however, cannot fully believe because they cannot escape the questions that occupy their mind. So, how does Kierkegaard approach this situation? He takes these two contradictory actions to their logical conclusion. Although he rigorously questions religion, he manages to preserve his faith. He also puts forward quite creative ideas on topics such as the concept of religion and its correct perception. There are many people who do not accept the validity of concepts such as religion and God. In response to this, Kierkegaard divides the concept of truth into two. 1. Objective truth. 2. Subjective truth. Kierkegaard observes that the things we call true are sometimes accepted by everyone, while at other times they are only our subjective truths. Objective truths are truths that are universally accepted and no longer open to debate. For example, the laws of physics, the aging of humans, or the knowledge that one day we will die are objective truths. If it is subjective truth, it is what a person accepts as true within their own inner world. Religion and belief in God fall under subjective truths, because while a person who believes in these concepts accepts them as true, another person may not believe in them. So, is life after death an objective truth or a subjective one? Since life after death is an unobservable event, it is a subjective truth. Therefore, a person who accepts the truth of life after death determines this within themselves. When we look around us, everyone has subjective truths as well as objective ones. The area where this distinction is most effectively observed is religion. Kierkegaard observes that religious people value subjective truths above objective truths. For example, even though the theory of evolution appears to be an objective truth, a religious person may not want to accept it. This is because subjective truths are more important to that person. Objective truths have their limits. For example, objective truths can only provide information about an autopsy report to someone who has lost a loved one in a tragic car accident. However, subjective truths offer answers such as the preservation of the deceased person's soul or reunion with them after death. Therefore, subjective truths reach places that objective truths cannot. Kierkegaard divides believers into two groups, fanatics and the devout. The fanatic views religion as an objective truth and attempts to prove their beliefs through logic and evidence. The devout person knows their faith is subjective and does not attempt to prove it to others. Kierkegaard wants people to reach the true form of religion rather than bigotry, and he calls this the knight of faith. For a person to become a knight of faith, they must go through three stages. The first of these is the aesthetic stage. A person in the aesthetic stage views life through the lens of pleasure and pain. They strive to increase their pleasures and reduce their pains. However, this way of life produces short-lived happiness, followed by boredom. According to Kierkegaard, boredom is a dangerous state for humans. This is because a bored person has the potential to harm both themselves and those around them. How can one escape this stage? Kierkegaard says that in order for a person to move to a higher stage, they must learn to face pain instead of merely pursuing pleasure. Suffering brings awareness to the individual. Through pain, a person turns inward and asks, "How am I?" At this point, the person is ready for the ethical stage. A person who has reached the ethical stage evaluates their actions not according to pleasure and pain, but according to the criteria of right and wrong. A right action must be done even if it causes pain. A wrong action must be avoided even if it feels pleasurable. Still, according to Kierkegaard, the ethical stage is not the final point, because what is ethical is not enough to make life meaningful. Kierkegaard argues that meaning cannot be found by reason alone. According to him, at some point, a person must put reason aside and make a leap of faith. This is not blind faith without questioning. On the contrary, it is continuing to believe despite doubt. According to Kierkegaard, true piety begins here. So why must we set reason aside? Because life presents us with pains that reason cannot resolve. To cope with these pains, we need something beyond reason, namely faith. Another concept Kierkegaard pondered was anxiety. Why do we feel anxious? For example, why does a tremor seize us when we look down from the top of a tall building? Most people explain this as fear of falling, but according to Kierkegaard, the real reason is that somewhere inside us, there is also a desire to jump. It is this hidden desire that creates anxiety in humans. Kierkegaard says that human desires are not always directed toward goodness. Sometimes humans can even have desires for their own evil. This dark side is at the root of anxiety. Freedom is also a source of anxiety. Humans are free to choose both good and evil. They can choose to improve themselves or destroy themselves. Knowing that no one can stop us, as in the case of jumping from a height, also creates anxiety.